Topic 9. How to run an empire. So how do you run this thing? You've got no email. You don't have telexes, telegraphs, fax machines. You can't tweet or Twitter. How do you run this thing? Well, you run it the old-fashioned way, with roads and written orders and written reports coming back. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about what I call the imperial machinery. And we're going to ask then, what were the advantages and disadvantages of Roman rule, and wonder how some of that changed over time. So we're moving forward generally, chronologically, though we're not doing the one damn thing after another, as we were doing before. I want to talk about these words center and periphery. Now, we've introduced these terms in an earlier topic. Rome, the city of Rome, is the beating heart of Rome. And throughout this course so far, sometimes I have used the word Rome to mean the city, and sometimes I have used the word Rome to mean the republic or the empire. And now when I'm talking about the empire, when I say Rome, I mean the whole kind of system. So that there's a center and a periphery. And remember that what Augustus was trying to do, and what Hadrian really did do, separated by about 100 years, was to make people realize that you could be as Roman, as far away from the city as if you were in the city. And remember that one of the things we're trying to do is build up not only a local elite, but a local elite who could work their way up in Romanitas, Romanness, and work their way to a job in the central headquarters. And over time, people from the provinces work their way so that they could be senators. That's it. I mean, that's the big time. But we're going to find over time as well that we have the center versus the periphery. When the center feels challenged, it's going to need more money. And where is it going to get that money? Raising taxes on people away from the city of Rome. When it needs more food, it's going to increase the amount that has to come in. And certainly we're going to find that when Rome is overextended, what is it going to try to do? It's going to try to save itself in the middle and begin to pull resources from the periphery. So how do we extend Rome to the provinces? We do it with this process of Romanization. Now, the Latin word that we have used several times already is Romanitas, and a word that is now, Romanitas is a Latin word, and in Italian, modern Italian, we have the word Romanità. Now that word has kind of been linked with the Vatican, that there's a way that the papacy works. There's a kind of a style. A perfect example would be that if there's a particular bishop or cardinal who's doing a bad job, he's promoted up, what some people call the Peter principle. And the principle embodied there is that you never want someone to look bad. You have to put a bella figura, a good face on it. And that's a perfect example of Romanità at work, Romanness at work. And you want people to think of themselves as Romans. Now, if I asked you right now, identity is very important. If I said to you right now, what are you? Some of you might say, I am a man or I am a woman. Some of you might say, I'm Jewish or I'm Muslim. Some of you might say, I'm a carpenter or a teacher. I'm a mother or a father or a grandparent. Others might say, I'm American, but others might say, I'm a Southerner. And within the South, others might say, I'm from Mississippi, or even a particular region. So when someone asks you, what are you, what you wanted to say, whether you were at the center or the periphery, was civis sumus. We are a citizen. Ego civis. I am a citizen. And that incentive of citizenship offered you protection. Certainly, we've all seen episodes of, say, the TV show Law and Order, where there's some diplomat working at the UN or a member of his family or her family. That person commits a crime. They're arrested by the New York Police Department, and you hear this phrase, I have diplomatic immunity, to use an example of a Jew who was protected by Roman citizenship. Paul, who first appears in Christian scripture or the New Testament as Saul, is a Roman citizen. Why? His dad. His father's a Roman citizen, and because he's a Roman citizen, Saul, who takes the name Paul after he has his conversion to Christianity, when he's arrested, says, I have a right to be tried in Rome because I am a Roman citizen, inherited from my father. And that's why he takes this, he turns it into his triumphal tour. He buys himself time, he writes letters, he evangelizes, and when he gets to Rome, Peter and Paul are both killed, likely in the aftermath of the fire that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. In the aftermath of that, Christians were killed on a large scale, the first large-scale time that that's happened. Peter, by tradition, is crucified upside down because he said he wasn't worthy of dying as his Savior, as the story goes. But a crucifixion is a criminal's, non-citizen's death because it is barbaric. Whereas Paul, as a Roman citizen, ethnically Jewish, just as Peter is ethnically Jewish, Paul, as a Roman citizen, is allowed, can I put it that way, to have his head chopped off because that is considered an honorable or merciful death. You see the distinction, and it's an important one. So you get protected as a citizen, but you also have to pay taxes, right? With every right, there is a corresponding duty or responsibility. Now, over time, citizenship is a glue of society. It keeps rebellions down, but sometimes it's watered down as well. And this is a very controversial thing that takes place in the year 212 CE. There is an emperor named Caracalla. Maybe some of you have been to Rome and have been to the ruins of the baths of Caracalla. It's mostly all now open air. And baths were not, these places where people went to, drink till they threw up and, had sex. Baths were places where people could wash. Now you say, well, duh. Yeah, well, the average person didn't have a bathtub, didn't have running water in his house. And so public baths were for everybody, and they were free. Now, there were different sections of the public baths, like you go to a baseball stadium today, right, and there's the cheap seats, and there's the luxury boxes, right? So that was true in the baths as well. But baths were places where people could wash because they knew that if you got the dirt away, disease would go down. So Caracalla builds these huge baths. You may be familiar with his name for that. But he's also famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, because in the year 212, he found that, boy, he needed a lot more money. And so he decided he declared a day, that anyone who, 9 a.m., let's say, on that day, who was standing within the boundaries of the Roman Empire was de facto a citizen, as long as he was free and not a slave. Now, can you imagine if an American president, with the ways we debate today about immigration, declared that tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., anyone who is in the 50 United States is a citizen? Boy, that would be a political turmoil. So some people said, great, we're going to get more people to serve in the army and to pay taxes, and this was clearly Caracalla's incentive. But other people said, you've just watered down citizenship. I've been working all these years for citizenship, and now the guy who just arrived yesterday is allowed to be a citizen? That's not fair. So you can see how valuable citizenship is then, and I would add now, such that we had law systems that separated citizens from non-citizens. There were 3 sets of laws, and we'll give you the Latin for them. Jus, or law, civile, the jus gentium, and the jus naturale. And let's separate those out. The jus civile was the law for citizens. That was the best one, the most protection. The jus gentium comes from the word for peoples. Gens, generation. Gens was the law for non-citizens who were under the protection of Roman rule. And if you want to use the phrase second-class citizenship, that'll serve just as well. But they also believed that there was something above and beyond written down law, something called natural law, something that the Romans inherited from Socrates, more so from Plato, and even more so from Aristotle, that Cicero talked about, that there is a law that people have by dint of being people that will be picked up later on in Christian philosophy, you find it in Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy as well, among some of the other ancient Eastern religions. And I think you can draw a line there to what became all men are created equal. That became the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the document that was really led by Mrs. Roosevelt after her husband's death. Something above and beyond, but less codified. And it's a reminder to us that while we have this how to run an empire, which seems very precise and very written down and very structured, that there was also a philosophical notion as well, that there was a natural law, a way that Romans acted. This was good and this was bad. This was moral and this was immoral. This was virtue and this was vice. And their officials were expected to embody these elements, not only to do their jobs, but to do their jobs fairly and with justice based on natural law. Now, of course, those are models, and it's not always going to have happened, but that was the ideal. And so you had officials at the local level and at the center Roman levels, and again, you wanted to work your way up. And I'm just going to give you a sampling because this was a very extensive and impressive structure. The person who is in charge of a province is a governor. That's a huge job. That's very, very, that's a place to make money because there's going to be kickbacks and bribes. It's a place to have power. It's a place to be away from the intrigue of the city of Rome, to have your own show. And if you want to get back to Rome, if you do well in the provinces as a governor, you could work your way back and pretty far up in the Senate. The governor was appointed by the emperor, but often with senatorial input. Sometimes you even had a senatorial governor and an imperial governor, but the imperial governor was obviously the senior. A censor, he is the tax auditor. So there's a tax auditor in every province, but then at the local level, there's a lower one, and the lower one aspires to be the tax auditor at the higher one, and then head of the IRS, if you will, in Washington, D.C. or Rome. Judges who were appointed by the Senate, obviously an extremely important role. That word was praetor. Municipal administrators. How's mayor? How is head of a city council? Called an aediles. And then somebody who was in charge of running the local level, the regional level, the provincial level, and then all the way up in the headquarters, the quaestor. And the word quaestor will become quartermaster. Some of you may be familiar with the word quartermaster from American military history. And the quaestor was in charge of financial and logistical details. So you could see that people who had a mind for logistics would go into one field, people who had a mind for numbers would go into another field, people who had a mind for law would go into a third field. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of Roman rule? Well, we talked about these earlier when we were talking about the spread of the empire. Certainly, infrastructures are going to improve. Roads, coinage. If coinage improves, then the economy becomes more standardized. People can't cheat you as much. Language and aqueducts, police and fire, what we would call social welfare. It's not good to have poor people in the streets. Somebody has to feed them. And it was the job of the local government to take care of that as well, and armies on site. So what you have here is a trade-off. The trade-off is you are getting safety and security that you would not otherwise have. But you're also getting a lack of total independence. And it seems that most municipalities decided as Rome spread, if you can't beat them, join them. And you certainly can't beat them, so you'll have to join them whether you want to join them or not. So why not join them first if Rome is expanding and Rome has a choice between this group or that group? Well, if I join Rome first, then they will help me against my enemy, unless they're smart enough to join first as well. So Rome as an empire gets involved in local politics and local disputes. And of course, Rome wants to put down those local disputes. Why? Because war is not good for business. Now, some of you may say, well, if you look back in history, rich people make money in war. Yes, that may be true then and now, but it is also true that people can't move about freely, goods can't move about freely in a time of war as they can in a time of peace. And so the Pax Romana is probably the best phrase to use when you ask, How do you run an empire, and what is the advantage of Roman rule? The Roman peace allowed for safety and security, and therefore a better economy for all at a higher level than you would otherwise have had. Now, what about this issue of enculturation or assimilation or accommodation? I think we can use those three words interchangeably. There are differences. Well, this goes center and periphery together, doesn't it, right? Because as Rome is spreading its culture, not only is it imposing its culture, but it's taking from that other culture, and that's the tapestry that I was talking about in an earlier topic. Are you losing your culture in their culture, your small local culture? To some degree, yes. But are you not also receiving Romanization and, in fact, increasing, diversifying Romanization by adding your culture to their culture? You add their culture to your culture, you add your culture to their culture, and this will be true going both ways. So it makes sense to enjoy Romanization and to cooperate with Romanization culturally as well, because you are part of something bigger. Now, there are always going to be small groups or good-sized groups that say, you know what, we would rather go it alone. We would rather not be a part. And in Greek history, we have the famous story of the Melian dialogue, where the island of Melos does not want to join the Athenians in fighting the Spartans, not join the Delian League versus the Peloponnesian League, and they say to the Athenians, we want to be Switzerland. Well, they don't quite put it that way, but that's what they're saying. We want to be the Red Cross. We want to be neutral. We won't impede you. We won't help you either. It's really not an option, as the Melians learned, and the Athenians end up destroying the population of Melos. So too, if you resist Rome, you're probably going to lose. We do have some examples of Julius Caesar going a little too far in Britain, and some of the Roman legions going a little too far on the Rhine and the Danube, and they retreat back. But pretty much the Romans are not giving up too much. And most of the time, populations want to be involved with the Roman Empire until the Roman Empire stops delivering. So you see, the Roman Empire is clearly the senior partner, but if the Roman Empire wants to spread, if the Roman Empire wants to survive and indeed thrive, it needs the cooperation of that local population. And here is where the story of Alexander the Great comes in, because Alexander the Great, who was a great model, a great hero to Julius Caesar, had this notion. Now, he certainly didn't have the managerial skills, nor the patience, I might add, to put this into place. But Augustus learned from Julius Caesar, as Julius Caesar had learned from Alexander the Great, that keeping on fighting those local populations is not going to serve you, because unless they feel part of the team, as you move forward, what do you have? An enemy at your back. So how can you expand with those pockets of dissent within? So it's in everyone's best interest to cooperate, even if sometimes you get swallowed in that something bigger or get exploited. Now, what about changes over time? One of the things that Hadrian realizes as he's touring, remember Thomas Jefferson sending Lewis and Clark out? One of the things that Hadrian notices is that he needs to organize this empire better. It's getting too big. The center is losing hold of the periphery, and we don't want too much local power. Local power, okay. Local autonomy, not okay. And so he reorganizes the center government so that it can be in a better relation with the periphery. Information and orders can go out, reports and taxes and goods can come back in. And so he sets up 6 imperial headquarters in Rome. And so you really wanted to be in charge of one of these. 1, correspondence. Basically a way of getting orders out, getting information back, answering questions and answers back and forth. The second, an ultimate, dare I say supreme, court of justice. Third, a treasury, a central place to receive taxes and to dispense. Fourth, library services. Now, not library services like you're checking books out. Library services like you're keeping an archive. So the correspondence and the library services worked closely together. Fifth, making sure that the trains run on time. Okay, that's way anachronistic. But roads. Making sure that what they called the cursus publicus, the public discourse, the public course or roads, and that was basically headed by a postmaster general. You may know that Benjamin Franklin, people wanted Benjamin Franklin to take all sorts of roles. What you may not know is that Benjamin Franklin, when he's a player in the 1770s, is at the end of his career. So he's really not interested in being president, but the one thing he wanted to be was postmaster general. He knew the importance of that, and some of you may still drive on roads in your towns that are called post roads. Well, those post roads were to make sure that the mail could go back and forth. So what travels on the road, the mail, is as important as the road itself, and in fact what travels on the road can't travel if the road is not kept clean and safe and in good repair. So the fifth was the cursus publicus, and the sixth was taxes. So we have these 6 imperial headquarters: correspondence, justice, treasury, library services, cursus publicus, and taxes. He also sets up what I call secondary schools across the empire. Now, they're not high schools in any modern sense, but they are advanced schools. So a boy would have a tutor at home. He would learn his Latin and his Greek grammar. He'd learn some rhetoric. But then he would go to kind of these advanced schools. And these advanced schools were for medicine, architecture and engineering, which were essentially the same things, and some philosophy and rhetoric. And he sets up these schools, interestingly enough, not just in the center, but in the periphery. Because if you want to train administrators on site, you need to have schools on site. You kind of think of the land-grant colleges, don't you, in American history. And he did one thing that I am totally in favor of, and that is that he gave pensions for retired teachers the same as for retired soldiers. He said a teacher is as important as a soldier is as important as a teacher, and they're going to get the same pensions. And I think that's great. Now, this empire got so big that an emperor called Diocletian in 293 said, we need to make some major change. This thing is now too big. I always tell my students, it's like, when you twirl that spaghetti on a fork, at some point you hit a point of no return. And on 293, Diocletian had hit the point of no return. And so at this point we have 40 provinces. And he says, wow, they're too big. I'm going to take those 40 provinces and I'm going to break them down into over 100, 105 as a matter of fact. Now you might say, wait a second, aren't you decentralizing too much? Aren't you going to lose control of 105? Yes, but he does something else. He takes those 105 smaller provinces and he carves them into 12 dioceses. Yes, I said diocese. Some of you may know the word diocese from Christianity, because when Christianity takes over, it's not going to reinvent the wheel. This is a great way to organize things, so they just take the very word diocese, which is a Latin word. So he takes the 40 provinces, he cuts them into smaller pieces, 105, but he organizes the 105 into 12 dioceses, and each diocese is going to be under a vicar. Again, another word that the Christian church is going to take. So what you now have is a kind of a federal situation. It's kind of like the United States. More federalism, more bureaucracy, higher costs, but also more local autonomy. And so the local people are going to be behind that. And then finally he cuts the empire in half. And he establishes what's called a tetrarchy. So there's an eastern half and a western half. Each side is going to have a senior and a junior emperor, an Augustus, senior, and a Caesar, who's a junior. The Caesar will be the heir apparent. It's a system that looks like it should work, but it ends up not working.